Good afternoon. My name is Lee McWhorter. I'm the instructor for the cybersecurity program at WashU, and welcome to our first lecture to go with the Intro to Security Foundations course. Today is 1/9/2018. These lectures are intended to supplement and complement the course material and exercises and labs that are online. I intend to do a number of things with these lectures. There'll be 2 per lesson cycle or course cycle, and they'll cover the first half of the lessons in a course, the first lecture, and the second lecture will cover the second half of those lessons to finish a course. I will continue to post the schedule in the student portal, so we'll have one next week, probably on Wednesday, but I'll post that in the coming days as I confirm the schedule for that with administration and whatnot. The intention for these lectures is to, like I said, supplement and support the course material. And so I'm going to try to do a number of things, including highlight, of course, the important concepts that are in the lessons covered under the lecture, as well as address any, say, more difficult concepts, and we'll somewhat drive that throughout the courses as people ask questions and as we get into the courses a little deeper, since this is the beginning and only the second day of a new term. But we will also try to then cover some additional examples than those that are in the courseware. And so those are kind of the main goals of making sure we hit the important parts, cover anything that's proving to be a little more challenging to understand, or some of the concepts that sometimes are a little more difficult, or exercises in the later courses, as well as to try to do some different examples and provide some different perspective to supplement those course materials and exercises online. For our Intro to Security Foundations class, this is the first class in the cyber program, and the 5 lessons that are covered in this lecture, or that will be reviewed over and discussed at least briefly, are the intro section, which covers some key terms and basics, and then we cover some overview information in lesson 2 on all the different security roles that are available within the field, and both covering that from sort of a conceptual as well as practical level of specific roles. And then we talk a little bit, our first introduction to various threat actors and attack types in lesson 3, and so we'll cover a little bit more of that and have some additional examples, a little additional detail on social engineering, particularly in this lecture today. And then we also have a sorry, my glare here, information security basics. So we'll talk about some of the concepts in lesson 4 related to information security. One of the big areas we'll try to talk about a little bit today is the 7 domains, and how important and why those are important to understanding and using within the networking and security worlds. And then lesson 5, the last lesson that will be addressed in this first lecture for the series, is on defense basics, and it's covers some very important defense concepts, and we will review them all, as well as one of the things I will try to do in this lecture today is, once again, add some more examples, and also sort of tie some of these together a little more clearly. One of the things that we did for sort of ease of understanding in some of the exercise and course materials on some of these concepts was many times use, say, for example, defense in depth, which we'll talk about more in a bit, but we might use different types of equipment as an example of that in the text and in the courseware. And while that's perfectly acceptable, I want to add a little bit more nuance to that and talk about how some of the controls and other things fit into that. So those are our 5 lessons today: the intro, the security roles, the information security basics, threats and threat actors, and then defense basics. And so we'll cover all those in a little bit of detail as we go through today. And if anybody has any questions, they can let me know. And of course, if you're watching this video later, you can reach me through the system or through my email. And we will be able to answer any questions. And of course, the mentors and the support systems there at WashU and Coder Camps can help as well. So let's start with the first lesson that the folks starting the program will have begun to look at. I know at least one student was in yesterday. And that is the Introduction to Security Foundations. The Security Foundation course provides sort of a level setting course throughout the program a lot of these concepts, of course, and we'll come back again and again throughout the program. So if we get them down now, then that you'll understand them better and how we use and apply them. And a lot of the terms and phrases and important concepts will come back again and again. And so it's important to get these things down in this first course and to get these concepts in these first 10 lessons down. In the first lesson, we start by just talking about what is information security. And of course, we reference that security comes from the Latin and various other things. I won't repeat all the content. The idea of information security is that it is all of the skills and concepts and best practices rolled together that are all about intended to protect the information resources and assets of various organizations, whether they be corporations, governments, educational facilities, individuals, nonprofits, etc. We generally use the phrase organizations in the coursework to refer to that broad spectrum of all the different folks, because we don't know where all some of you will go. Some of you will go on and work for government, go on private sector, and some of you will probably work for various nonprofits or non-governmental entities or whatever, using your skills, as these are very important and growing areas for all different types of organizations. We cover a lot of key terms in this first chapter, and so if you're having any trouble in the first lesson, like I said, please reach out to myself or our mentor Jason to discuss any of that. Of course, as you read through it, you can research a little further. You can also, of course, there's some quizzes to take to help reinforce those concepts. We will talk about most of these key terms, of course, again and again, and even in this lesson. And so, but one of the ones that I really wanted to talk a little bit about is how it, especially how it fits into information security, is what's called the CIA triad. This is in our Central Intelligence Agency. This is the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data that we need to protect, and that is the three what are called the three protections that we need to provide to information and information resources. And so what we're wanting to make sure is that the data stays confidential, that it only is accessible by the people who have the rights and the needs to know, that that data stays, that the integrity of that data is maintained. One of the problems, of course, is maybe the data is changed behind the scenes. There's a classic scene in the old War Games movie of the student changing his grade, for example, or whatever. That would be a violation of integrity. And then, of course, availability can be obviously a good example of an attack that sometimes makes the news. A denial of service obviously takes down a site and thus takes down the availability of that data. And so we're trying to protect all of those things, and we do that by then protecting information assets along the way. Maybe that's encrypting, storing securely. We will protect all the various devices that are part of it, the network, the computers, the routers, everything. And over the course of this entire program, we will cover all of those different aspects. And so you will see how the things that we do later in some of the other courses come back to this, that what we're doing is protecting the confidentiality, or by using user rights and putting in permissions and radius servers and all kinds of things, which we'll more fully define as we go forward. And by using encryption, we're trying to protect the data and protect its integrity. And then by protecting ourselves, having multiple layers of defense and even having backup and recovery plans, we want to protect the availability, so that obviously it's important for organizations to have access to their data. It could be their customer list. It could be the source code of a game if you're a programming company. It could be any number of different things. And so this is what information security in a nutshell is about, is protecting those information and organizational assets, and all the technology and networks and devices that go around and access and help us use and manipulate that data. And we are going to attempt to protect that so the organization can achieve its objectives. And this is a really critical point. Security is not done in a vacuum just for the purpose of security. Security is done to achieve an organization's objectives. So if that's a software company, they want to put out software and make money. And so the security organization and the security procedures and practices that we put into place are going to try to protect that proprietary source code, protect our customer list, protect our website where we might be selling those websites. So each organization is going to prioritize and decide what they need to do, and then we're going to be doing these steps along the way to protect the assets that help us achieve our objectives. We also are, of course, one of the things we're going to talk about and that we've layered into this course and throughout the entire program is just the continuing evolution of this space. Years ago, it was simpler times of very limited access, and only certain people and very highly technical people could sort of be the average hacker. And then over time, that has become easier and easier. One of the attack type vectors and then one of the attack threat actors we're going to talk about are what are called commonly script kiddies. And we just had a new crop of them here as we got through Christmas and into the new year. I always joke that every year when some new children out there get their new computer, their first computer, their first device, some of them, some proportion, immediately go off and start trying to research how to attack and crack and do all these neat things from their point of view. And of course, then that puts the challenge on us that now there's all these new potential threats out there. And of course, the world is evolving. Not only is it becoming easier to attack, and there's all these challenges we face in the world of security, but there's all these new devices. We're going to talk off and on again about something called the Internet of Things, and how many of you already have this. Maybe you have a smart thermostat at home, or you have a baby monitor, or you're aware of these types of smart devices and controlled things. There's smart refrigerators that can talk to an app and tell you when your milk's going bad. And that's all grand for the future, but every one of these devices, especially when they end up in homes or in small organizations, potentially, and even larger ones, become potential attack vectors and security threats. And many of these consumer devices are not really today putting security at the forefront. And so we need to be aware of these growing challenges as we move on down through the course. We make a comment in the course merit that, years ago it would have been just laughable to think that somebody would hack a network through a coffee maker. But today, that's theoretically possible as smart coffee makers are coming online. And so somebody, maybe without even thinking about it, without checking with the appropriate people, or maybe if there isn't a full security policies in place to address it. So coffee machine breaks at an office, they take some petty cash, they go out and they buy a new coffee machine, they plug it in. Oh, it's got a network cable, let's plug that in. Oh, it tells us when the coffee needs to be remade, or whatever the case is, and it's great, they love it. But then that device gets hacked, and now the attackers have an inside the firewall device that they can probe and try to stretch their attacks out. So we'll cover these things, and we'll then cover, of course, things to do to address these things. So lesson 1 covers a lot of important definitions. Like I said, I'm not going to repeat them in our limited time to cover so many lessons, but if you're having any questions and not quite grasping any of the concepts, please let us know and we'll try to address them. But do make sure you work your way through the material, see if you can get all the quizzes right, and then of course do the exercises, which is some additional research in these areas. And you should, by the end, have a solid understanding, if you didn't know some of them coming in, what an attack is, what different threats and various things are. And of course, we'll continue to layer more depth onto those as we move deeper into the course. After lesson 1, which is sort of the intro to the intro course and sets up, like I said, some concepts and some key terms we're going to keep using, we move into lesson 2, which is on security roles. And this lesson is kind of broken into 2 pieces in a way. We start off covering what are called some conceptual roles. And these are roles of like the owner of data, or the custodian of data, etc. And sort of like with the key terms, I don't intend on spending my few minutes for each lesson just repeating those things. They're all clearly in the materials. But the idea that I want to reinforce is that the reason we talk about those conceptual roles is because many times, and we'll get to this in the later part of the course, as organizations learn about security, put in best practices, and begin to implement guidelines and procedures so that their organization can be more secure, then these terms come back up. And when you use some of what are called the security frameworks out there, which are guideline sets, we'll cover more later, that allow us to help an organization put together a security program for their whole entity, they will use these terms. And so the owner of data is somebody who owns it from the point of view of administration. And then a custodian is somebody who, and so on and on, these different, and of course a user is the easiest one, everybody. All of us have probably been the user of a system. In our home context, we're the owner, we're the custodian, we're everything, of course. And so all of this data is useful to individuals at home or in their home environments, their family environments. And a lot of us geeks, of course, end up being the support for our families. So some of these things will apply at home, but most of these are, of course, really geared toward the organizational environment. And so different types of jobs that have real titles, you know, chief security officer or security administrator or whatever the case is, can map back to some of those conceptual roles. And the reason those conceptual roles, like I said, are important is because some of the guidelines that we may be following later in your organizations, they may reference those roles. Okay, the owners of the data have these responsibilities. They define these things. They answer these questions. They're who we go to get budgetary permission and various things. And then, of course, the users are, a lot of the policies are written to address how the users interact, the password policies, acceptable use policies, things that many of you have dealt with when you've worked at different organizations or at different schools you've gone to in the past. Even these days with modern tech, high schools, of course, have certain policies and guidelines and rules, whether you can or cannot bring your devices on, can you use them at this or that. So every organization creates these policies and guidelines. And one of the big groups they're trying to help influence is the users, and to give them guidelines on what their password strings should be, who should have access. And so it's important to understand these conceptual roles. And there is an exercise that is all part of sort of linking, or a quiz that's sort of linking those organizational roles to real roles. Then the later part of the class talks about, or the lesson 2 on security roles talks about more practical security roles, real, if you will, the things you might see if you were looking for a job on Indeed or some other website, Career Builder or whatever. And so you would find things like a security administrator and penetration testers and all these different roles that we talk about. And we talk about roles both at the intro, intermediate, and advanced levels. And there is some different paths that can happen through all that. Keep in mind, one of the things we sort of ask you to do, in a sense, in the exercises is to sort of research your own potential career track. Nothing locking in. This isn't your high school counselor making you say what you're going to do in the future, but it's something that you might be interested in. And as you're going to see in this field and as you go on in the program, one of the things that is common and we're going to talk about is some concepts here a little later on in defense basics, actually in this first lesson, in first lecture, in the fifth lesson actually, is the concepts of separation of duties and rotation of duties. It's very common in security these days that somebody who's in a particular role, like a system admin role, security admin role, might be responsible for a particular batch of services or processes or machines, and then that's rotated later, as we'll talk about, for security reasons, and somebody else takes on that role. Depending on the size of the organization, those can be very narrowly defined, but if a mid-sized organization only has a handful of people, then the rotation of roles may be much more significant, from even title to the responsibilities. And we'll talk about why we do those type of things in lesson 5 here in a minute, but the reason we point out these different examples, and there are lots of others, it even mentions in the quizware that you can almost tag together a lot of these words, security admin this and security analyst this, and mix and match, and you'll see all different kinds of combinations as you start looking out there, both for the exercise research as well as in future looking for jobs. You'll see that the ones we talk about are good examples, but there are others that would fall into each of the intro, intermediate, advanced levels, and the paths through each of these can vary depending upon if somebody who comes into security as a student and is interested in this area, and maybe their background has been, or their interest has been more on the devices and network, they might go sort of security administrator, a step beyond sort of network administrator. They're not just administering the network now, they're helping to secure it, audit it, do all the things we're going to learn about in this program. And then, of course, somebody who's been more of a programmer, potentially, interest, coder, scripter, they might decide they like the writing custom things, attack scripts and probing scripts, and they might go down the pen tester route. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you could go any number of these routes, and you could still end up being, after different roles and moving up through administrator, doing some auditing experience and project management, so that you're running the whole security for an organization. And then someday you might be the chief security officer for an organization. And they could, just like the CEO could come from sales or come from marketing within tech, security people can come from programming, from networking, from more general support, and then they can take different roles in security within. They can be pen testers, they can be admins, they can be trainers. It's very important in larger organizations that they're, and a matter of fact, we'll see later in some of the requirements. Companies that are required, that take credit cards and have to follow those standards, have to do some level of information and education to their staff about the various security practices of their organization. And larger organizations have whole teams dedicated to that. So you can be an auditor, you can be a trainer, you can be in all different types of things within security. The last thing that lesson talks a little bit about, which we talked about in some of the webinars leading up to this program, and so I won't spend a whole lot of time, but to say that the future for security people is quite bright. There's already well over 1 million, give or take, some sites higher, some sites lower, but millions of unfilled jobs, with that expected to grow 10, 20% or more in the coming years. We cite some statistics from one site in our courseware and in some of the webinars, so I just won't repeat all that. But the idea is that this, as we see every day, it seems like we see more and more attacks, more and more news of breaches, more and more people impacted. And as such, more and more organizations waking up to the fact that either they need to finally get security in the first place, or they need to improve their security. Even the largest organizations and the most secure organizations, as we've found in the last few years, have been attacked or have found a way in, sometimes through third parties, sometimes through other mechanisms that are a little more unique, all part of those growing challenges we face in security. And so there is a need for people interested and driven in this area to try to help address that and help companies be more secure and protect their information and assets. So then as we move on, after sort of setting that intro in 1 and then talking about conceptual and real roles of security in 2, and we start to talk about some basics of just attacks and threat actors. And in our context, an attack is generally any attack from sort of one system to another. There's different ways to define it. It can be computer to computer, but there ultimately are even attacks that are, in a sense, not digital. There's the one that I want to spend some time on. We talk about in the courseware, but it's one that's kind of one of the ones that gets a lot of buzz, and so I wanted to supplement that with some additional examples, etc. But that's social engineering. We've all heard that phrase probably at one time or another. So what kinds of attacks are there? Well, there's sort of attacks that have been around for a while, whether they be a whole bunch of computers ganging up on another and just sending a bunch of traffic, what's called the denial of service attack, to shut down, say, a site or a company or a web server. Of course, there's been malware and viruses for years, and some of those have been released into the wild and they affect us all, and some are, these days, even more and so, are being targeted at companies and individuals to try to reach them. And so we have to be aware of all of those kind of attacks that have been around, just remote break-in and brute force password cracking and all kinds of different attacks. But today we have newer attacks, as I mentioned earlier, this growing Internet of Things, putting a chip and putting radio connectivity or network connectivity, wireless, Bluetooth, whatever, into just about every device, as many people envision in the years to come, is going to provide all kinds of new potential attacks. There's already been old attacks redone. One of the largest denial of service attacks ever carried out, as far as researchers are aware of to date, which was just an insane amounts of bandwidth, was ultimately traced back to a bunch of IoT type devices, lots and lots of little cameras and baby monitors and a whole bunch of things like that that were taken over, turned into bots, as we phrase them. They're still doing their camera work, but somebody's now got code running in the background, and that code was then spread out to millions of devices. And then these devices were all turned on particular entities. And so denial of service attacks, which we'll look at in much deeper in other parts of the course, where usually can be very devastating because the receiving company can't do much about it directly. If your server just all of a sudden starts getting a lot of requests, even if they're false ones, then your machine is going to have to deal with that. And many times it's actually one of the, from my point of view, one of the scariest types of attacks, even though it's an old school attack, because you generally have to kind of either have multiple centers and redundancies yourself, or have to work with your providers, your ISP, to help get that attack stopped at a step up. Otherwise, if it reaches your machine's going to respond to that ping. It's going to respond to that web request or that DNS request or whatever is being forced on it. And of course, many times they're fake. they'll ask that server for something and tell it to send it over here, and that address doesn't exist, but our machine is going to deal with that company's machine. So there are all kinds of old attacks. There are also a lot of new attacks we have to be aware of. And these new attacks are being brought on because of, just the embedding of technology into everything we do, and embedded systems and the Internet of Things. Just checking all my notes. Like I said, I wanted to talk a little bit more about social engineering. Social engineering is an interesting thing. It can run the gamut. Some people would say that, in a sense, spear phishing, which is a phrase of, if you've heard PHISH, phishing is those emails you get that look like they're coming from your bank or whatever. And those are kind of general purpose phishing. They know that a lot of people bank at Bank of America or Citibank or some big bank, so they'll send out just millions of fake emails, hoping that a few people, and of course usually that's the case, a few people will fall for it and they'll get a few accounts, or they'll get some information or do whatever they're attempting to do when that person clicks on that link and it's not Citibank or whatever. But of course there's also what's called spear phishing, which is sometimes people will target that phishing, not just sending it out to millions. They are targeting at specific people. Maybe it's the security officers of a company, the developers of a company, and they're trying to, by doing some research. I remember reading about one attack where some entity, unknown at this point, at least to one at the time of the reading, was trying to reach and try to get into some of the higher end software companies, Microsoft, Apple, Oracle, all the big boys. They were trying to reach it. Most people would think that was probably a nation state or somebody trying to do some espionage, and that's what it looked like. But like I said, no attribution as to who. But what they did kind of uniquely is they joined some forums out on the internet that programmers gather at, and they sort of lurked there and listened and read about and saw, and they began to learn about some of these people who are posting about the projects they're working on, answering questions amongst themselves, which happens a lot in the open source community and just on the internet in general. And so they were able to gather some information and then send some very targeted, real looking but fake emails. Oh, here's that code I told you about on the site I was going to send you. Take a look at this. And that was really the attachment that had the virus. And so that's a degree of social engineering. They're engineering by pretending to be somebody and making it. But sort of some of the best examples of social engineering is when they don't involve even a digital piece, at least not directly. There was a series of bank robberies up in the Midwest a number of years ago that I used as an example in some former courses I taught. What was fascinating to me about it was how they pulled off the heist. It wasn't an armed robbery. It wasn't a brute force break-in. They literally sent somebody into the bank, one of the branches, and they were dressed up like they were a computer technician, ostensibly from the company this bank used to outsource their computer stuff. And they walked in, and the gentleman in question kind of went up to the receptionist or office manager there at the entry and said, I started looking through a folder. I'm here to fix, let me find her name. And the person at the desk goes, oh, Susie's computer. Yeah, because, in a big bank or in an office, probably somebody's got a problem at any given time, and they were kind of counting on that. I'm sure he didn't have a work order for Susie. He was pretending. He was social engineering his way into the building. I'm here to fix a computer. I can't remember her name. Oh, it's Susie. She's back over here. And so the receptionist leads this tech to that computer. This gentleman then goes down and works on said computer. He fixes it, actually. This is an impressive part of the story to me. He fixed the issue, got the updates to work or whatever he needed to do. But while he was there fixing her computer, he then spliced into their network and installed a rogue access point on their network. And from a hotel across the street, they were able to then start to break into the bank. And how they did from there is not really relevant. The social engineering part was the part that I was really the most impressed with. They had somebody just walk in and pretend to be a tech, and it worked. This is the kind of stuff that happens and that you'll see hackers try to do. A potential example could be, say, okay, I'm trying to target your firm and I'm going to be the hacker. And sure, I've scanned your network and I've read about you online and I've done all these, let my software do its stuff, and I've scanned your firewall, but I need some more information. I'm gonna get in. It comes down to. So I actually contact one of your salespeople, and I act like I'm the owner of a business, and I need to come in, and I want to be able to talk about it and give me your demo. I'm really interested. I'm going to sign up. And so we arrange a meeting. I come down to your office, or maybe I don't. I have somebody go do that for me. But while they're there, we delay, stall, possibly social. Hey, can you get me one of the, you mentioned that there was a power or there was a printout you guys have. Do you have one? Oh, so he leaves the office to go get that catalog or printout or whatever you want. And of course, at that moment, assuming you're hoping to find a weakness, maybe you unplug his voice over IP phone and plug your computer into that. If things aren't set up right, you very well may get an IP on their network and you're inside. And so you've social engineered your way into the building and have managed to gain access, maybe leave something behind, or at least do a little quick reconnaissance of what's going on inside the network. Now you have more data that you can go on and conduct your attack. So social engineering has, as the name implies, it's social. They'll use social media to find out about you and target attacks. They'll use, you know, just good old guile and a little bit of smoke and mirrors sometimes to pull things off. So we have to be aware. We have to train our employees and members of our organizations how to be aware of these things. And sometimes you just have to put policies in place. At a place I used to work a number of years ago, and where I was in charge of IT and production for the overall corporation, one of the rules I put into place was that nothing that looked like an IT bill was going to be paid until it came through myself or another designated person, because the reality is that people, and if you've been in this space for a while, if you own domains or websites, other companies out there will send you what looks like a renewal notice for your domain, and they're really just trying to kind of slam you over to their service. And if your accounting person pays that bill, then you've renewed your domain for 2 years, but now it's not at GoDaddy or Network Solutions. It's with some other host, who knows where, whether that's, you know, illegitimate or just a bad business practice, kind of shady business practice, whether that's going to be a, you know, a bad host there that's got your domain and they're going to do something worse is not really the point. It's still, we put in procedures so that those kind of things didn't accidentally happen and we didn't accidentally change providers. And so we have to be aware of the emails and teach our employees and staffers about phishing and the various types of attacks. We have to be aware of the different types of potential threat actors. And so real briefly, some of those, of course, the old hacker, we all know about that. The nation state actor is becoming an important player. I mentioned one earlier in this lecture about that was believed to be a nation state, where they were trying to target developers at top-end technology companies, and their approach was to get on the forums, find out about them, and then to conduct this very targeted spear phishing campaign to gain access to their intellectual property and their code. And then, of course, I mentioned the script kiddies as well. It used to be that that wasn't the case. Today, there's an estimate that anywhere from 40 to 60% of the various attacks and scans and probes and things that are going on out there are attributable to this bunch, this group. And while they can be fairly easy to defend against because they're somewhat less sophisticated using automatic tools, etc., they still generate a lot of attacks and a lot of traffic, and so you have to be aware of those. There are insiders, a very common example. One of the worst things that can happen to a company is to have bad internal security that allows, say, an employee who was fired to have still their internet access days, weeks, months later, and then they can come in and do something. And so there's all different types of threat actors, and as we'll talk about it and later, there's even what we call non-human threat actors as well, where we're dealing with things like a hurricane that still could cause a threat to our organization, our data centers, our corporations, our information. And so we have to factor those into our security and business continuity and recovery plans. So then I've got a couple more to go through here as we move on through this lecture. Lesson 4 is on information security. And it talks particularly about if security is just a general trying to be safe from danger or harm, and information security is specifically about trying to protect the information and informational assets of an organization. We want to talk about that a little more in detail. And one of the key concepts that we bring up in that lesson is the concept of controls. The word C-O-N-T-R-O-L, control, like controlling someone. Well, they're controls, and when we use them in information security context, we are talking about any measure, digital, physical, virtual, paperwork, whatever, any measure that we use to help do information security, to secure our data, to secure our resources and assets. So for example, some of the things we've already mentioned, acceptable use policy. Most employees of larger corporations sign a piece of paper. It says, okay, yeah, I can or cannot use this to surf to my personal email. I can on break hours, whatever the rules are of the acceptable use of the systems they've been given access to. They can't conduct personal business. They shouldn't play games. They shouldn't load third-party software without permission from IT, whatever. The rules of acceptable use. That is a control that we put on in place. We make employees sign and we try to impose so that we protect our network, so that people aren't just bringing games from home and installing, malware on our systems or downloading third-party software, using up all of our bandwidth, streaming media, whatever the case is. Companies put these rules in place. Those are controls. When we have a password policy, that's a control. Your password has to be a certain length. It has to be certain sizes. It needs to be renewed every so often. Whatever those rules are, that's a control. And we use controls. A lock on a door is a control of physical controls. Cameras are controls. Routers and firewalls to protect network traffic. Security, antivirus software, all of these things are controls. And you'll see this phrase again and again and again through this program. We'll talk about implementing controls. We'll talk about deciding and recommending controls. And as I've mentioned, even though we'll get to it later in the second part of this, of course, we'll really get into controls a lot when we talk about some of the frameworks that organizations use to develop their overall security policy. And so what you'll see is that information security is a whole process where organizations will do an analysis of their own situation and, of course, define and usually already have their goals. We want to be the best in this industry. We want to make money. We want to donate, and be good profit and help people, whatever their goals are. And then the security review and assessment of the risk the company faces. Oh, we run a website. We have a risk there. We use accounting software in the cloud, or we use various things. So the process of going through the entire analysis of an organization and looking at what are its risks, what are its weaknesses, where are the threats and potential vulnerabilities coming together that could lead to a true, a vulnerability and exploit happening, or a breach or any kind of theft. We want to be able to stop those things. And so we look at the why we do this. One of the big reasons we do it why is because it's, in this day and age, becoming more and more important. It's almost mission critical. It can cost companies just a lot of money if they lose, have a major breach. Sony, it cost them a bunch. We mentioned how much in the courseware, so I won't go into that. And that's one that most people, especially a lot of our students, I assume, are gamers and technology folks, can understand. The PlayStation hack of a few years ago, but the more recent Equifax hack affected 3 in 4 of every American. 3/4 of our population was affected by that breach. And so they're having to buy credit protection. They're losing a lot of goodwill. They may be losing customers and people that don't trust them. And all of those things come together. And of course, in this day and age, there's legal reasons why. In many states and in the US and in Europe, there are requirements to report breaches. There are requirements. And so as part of information security, we learn all about this stuff as well. And then the last thing in lesson 4 that is put in there in relation to information security is something that, especially folks that have come into this program from a previous, say, networking experience, computer support, networking plus kind of a line of things, will have heard of, is what's called the OSI model. And I'm not going to beat it up here or pull up a slide. I'm running out of time a little bit, it looks like, getting closer to, since I still have a little bit more to go. But nonetheless, the OSI model is very important. It breaks up it's a theoretical conceptual model of what is going on basically on a network. And the reason that it's important is because of a number of things. One, you will see it referenced in many of the security frameworks and in many of the best practices. How do you protect at different layers of that model? How do you protect very low level at the router levels and with the routing protocols? How do you protect at the application layer, the higher layers, say a website or a game? And so there are steps of security that apply all throughout the OSI model. And we are also finding, of course, and it's a common practice and something that's asked about on various certifications exams, is where things fall into the OSI model. So it's important to get that OSI model down. If you're having any questions, once again, let myself or Jason know. I think once you read through it and work through a few of the exercises, I think you'll understand it if you haven't had exposure to it before. And if you have, then, great, this will be a little bit of a review in that context. But it's important to understand OSI, not just specifically how it maps to the networking, that's what it is, but how that then maps to security and how you're protecting those different layers. And so we do different things, and as we'll learn in later courses, we're going to do different things to secure different parts of that model and different parts of our network and different parts of our information infrastructure. Then the last lesson in this that we'll cover in this first lecture for the Intro to Security Foundations course is on defense basics. This is lesson 5. Basically, sorry, reduce, but the things that it does is it starts off talking a little bit about some of the challenges. We've already talked a little bit about those, so I'll leave most of that to the course material, but this world is definitely changing. We are seeing a growth in the number of devices. We're seeing new devices, new device types. It's amazing to me, and I'm not that old, but I have a smartphone that's old, and it's way more powerful than the supercomputers of just some years ago, and we're all carrying one of these around, and there are billions of them on the devices, and of course then all the computers and servers, and these days, of course, some very important concepts that we talk about in later courses in more detail, but virtualization in the cloud, as you probably heard about online, which is basically hosting servers up on the internet, in many cases in a virtual capacity. There's not one machine running that one. There's multiple big servers running lots of virtual servers for different clients or for an organization. And this allows for very rapid deployment and scaling of web applications and web services. And it has been the boon of the startups. Was part of the .com, and we didn't have that methodology like Amazon Web Services of the cloud. So we set up our own data center, and almost every .com back there did. Today, the startups can just spin all this up as it's raised in the cloud. And so we have devices, virtual devices, real devices. We have the smarts of a supercomputer embedded into a thermostat. We have all of these things, refrigerators, coffee machines, and on and on and on. And we're ever connected, and more people around the world are connected. And so we're looking at a global network that we're all in one way, shape, or form connected to. So that means that we can be attacked from anywhere in the globe. And of course, that is drastically increased the amount of attacks. There are sites out there on the web. I think one of the videos in the courseware shows a picture of an attack map, and there's these lines going from all over the world, all from East Asia to the Middle East to Europe, and back and forth across the Atlantic and the Pacific between China and Japan and US. And these are just the attacks that are going on at any given time. I'm actually doing this, conducting this course in my office, which I have a few servers that are actually on the internet just over here to my side. And if I was not watching this screen and talking to you, I would be watching some of those screens, and I can guarantee you I could look over right now and there'll be some kind of an attack. Automatic defenses can kick in, and of course we have people that help monitor this stuff, so we respond, and that's the kind of stuff we're going to teach you about as we go forward. But beyond just our servers being constantly attacked, now there's all these new machines. They're scanning for all these internet connected machines, so the challenges are constantly going up in our space as more and more devices come online and more players come online. More and more kids get a new computer every Christmas. We had a whole bunch, as I said, of new attackers born just a few weeks ago. Why do we defend? Well, why would you not, right? I mean, why do you lock your front door is, I think, one of the examples in the courseware, and a good example. Why do you lock your car? Why do you try to look both ways before you cross the street? You want to be safe. You want to be secure. So why do we defend? Well, we want to make sure that our assets and our information is, once again, it's confidential. We protected the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that data and information. We want our organization to accomplish its goals. If we're trying to sell products and make money and our customer list is offline, then all of a sudden this could be a real problem for our company. If we are an e-commerce provider that makes the vast majority, if not all of our money online, and our website goes down and we don't have a backup plan or a backup hotspot, whatever the case may be, some way to get recovery from that fairly quickly, then we could be out of business in a short period of time. And so if we are attacked and breached, and we're not meeting various regulatory requirements, if we were in, say, the healthcare space or in the education space or in the financial spaces where there are regulations that require the protection of that private personal information of those customers. And in most cases, regardless, you could be selling some kind of crafted stuff, and if your customer list was exposed and had things like credit card numbers, social security numbers, or other things, then you're liable potentially for that. That's why so many of these big companies are buying all that credit protection. So an Equifax and a Sony can afford to spend millions of dollars to buy all their customers. But what if you're a small startup who had a hit run away and you had millions of people play your game or buy your product or use your new app, and then your database got breached? It might put you out of business. So we defend to protect our organizations, to protect our employees, to protect our customers, and to protect our reputations, and to avoid legal and financial cost. So one of the things that we then talk about is, in this defense basics, is, okay, now that we've learned about these attacks, we learned about all these different attackers, we've got the basics of what we're trying to do. So what are some of the key concepts that we use to begin to do those defense steps? And some of the key concepts we talk about are, and one of the most important that you'll definitely see again and again, almost all these you will, but this one for sure, is what's either called defense in depth or layered defenses. This is one of the most, if not the most important defense concept. The idea that we don't want to just put up one defense mechanism and to count on it. Most people, I think, and maybe I'm over speaking a little bit, I don't know, rural America, but most people, at least most of the houses I've lived in, have had more than one lock on the front door or the back door, for example. There would be a key lock or a bolt lock, as well as maybe a slider bar or a chain that one. And so there's an example of layered defenses. I have more than one layer of defense there. You might be able to pick one lock, but maybe you aren't strong enough to break through the other layer. And so we want to take that, and this is the same thing the military does, or think of a castle as a good example, right? You've got your moat, you've got your being able to throw down boiling oil and shoot arrows on the intruders and draw up your drawbridge. And so these are layers of defenses. And the military, of course, uses this in the defense of bases and defense of frontline theater operations. And so we need to take some of these exact same concepts and apply them. And so, for example, in the courseware, we talk about if an organization just had a firewall, which is a device to protect from traffic coming in, and we'll talk more about those later. But if we had a firewall up defending our network from the outside world, and that was it, that wouldn't be a layered defense or defense in depth. Instead, it would be strictly one line. And if somebody got through that, or like I used the example earlier, if somebody coming in to see a sales guy and plugs into your network and gets on, then he's on. And if this person gets, the outside attacker gets past that firewall, then they have, of course, breached your defenses. And so why it's so critical is we want to lay out multiple layers of defenses so that the attacker can be slowed down or tripped up at different steps. And the idea being that hopefully that attacker cannot get through all those layers of defense. And even if they manage to over time, that we're given warning, we're able to respond, maybe we can isolate, there's different things. Now, in the courseware, as I mentioned, we have a tendency to use an example like that. Okay, you've got one router or one firewall. That's not layered defense. Let's add another one. Okay, now we've got a layered defense. But the problem there is that we're layering the same thing. It's not different. And so that's another concept we talk about called diversity. And so even in that, we talk, which is in that case, let's say we're going to have a firewall from vendor A and now another firewall, another layer, but from a different vendor so that we have diversity as well as layered or depth. And that's generally used in courseware. We use sort of hardware examples, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly legitimate, but it's one of the things I wanted to kind of add to here in the lecture is that since I just talked about controls are any mechanism that can protect. And so controls can be used in relation, and they don't all have to be devices or technology. So let's take that example a little further. We have a company that has a couple different firewalls to be layers of defense. And in addition, they have from different vendors. And so those are a little diverse. Now, in reality, we'd have more devices and more steps, but let's layer in the controls. If a company just went out and bought a firewall, threw it up on the network, hey, we're protected, we got a firewall, but they left it all at the default settings, then the odds are that's not very secure. As a matter of fact, it doesn't take much more than a Google search to probably find out the default password and the right attackers are in. So there needs to be a policy on how to set up a firewall for your company as part of your security, just like having an acceptable use policy that every user has to sign and a password policy that every user has to adhere to. We're going to have a firewall policy or a guideline or a procedure, and it's going to tell our security and IT staff how we want that firewall set up. We're going to change the password to this scheme away from the default. We're going to set up these ports and not these ports. We're going to set up these rules and these filters. And that has got to be documented and defined. If done, then now we have defense in depth. We have not only a firewall, but we have a hardened and secure firewall that's followed a policy, and that policy is one of our defense in depth. And so then we come down to another piece of equipment. It's got a piece of policy. It may have other policies as well, other controls. Only certain people are allowed to access those devices, not just anybody, obviously. We only want very senior, say, security admins to manage some of these devices and implement that security policy. So while everybody has to follow the acceptable use as a control organization-wide, and every firewall has to use the security firewall policy and be set up that way, only certain people have the authority and need to know about that and how to set that up, so we keep that secure. And by having multiple pieces of equipment and multiple rules and controls and policies and procedures, we really begin to have defense in depth and a diverse arrangement. And so we can use equipment from different vendors. We can use guidelines and policies. So we might have a different policy on how we set up a router and how we set up a switch, how we set up any client workstation. A new computer is brought in for a new employee. How do we set that up? We have a policy on that sets up antivirus and locks down the user's ability to change things. These policies are a big part of what we do in security. It's sure there's hacking and countermeasures and there's all that stuff, but we do need to understand these concepts and understand controls. And you will be producing some in later courses as this program goes on. And it's a big part of what people in security field do. They help create these for new companies or companies that are just finally getting around to putting a full security policy and procedures in place. But companies that have been doing this for years are constantly doing this. This is an iterative process. We are always looking to improve our security controls. And an organization has to constantly, even if an organization has put together the most beautiful, full-featured security procedures and policies, and they've got it all documented. They've got procedures on acceptable use and passwords and networking architecture and design and security and how to configure and secure all the different devices, and everything is working and they feel like they're really secure. And then there's a new upgrade to a piece of equipment. That, at least in a minor iteration, requires them to go back and look at, do we need to change our policy on how we upgrade and how we do that equipment? What if that company goes and acquires another company and they come in with a whole bunch of new technology and we're supposed to integrate? It's time to once again redo our policy, restart that process. And especially something as major as an acquisition, we may very well need to do it almost completely over, start from the beginning. Now we've acquired, we've merged. Our objectives may be slightly different. We're not only wanting to sell X, but sell Y and coordinate them as a new together. Whatever the objectives of the organization are, now we have to account for that in our security policies and posture and organizational outlook. And so these ideas of controls and the ideas of understanding security policy and these concepts like defense in depth and diversity are very important. The last couple I mentioned already, so I won't. I mentioned when I was talking about security roles and how people in different roles sometimes change. A very common and sort of related concepts are what are called separation of duties and rotation of duties. And they're also important. And they can be looked at in lots of different ways. We use certain examples in the courseware, but they can be applied in all different kinds of ways. Like I mentioned earlier, it's not uncommon within a security infrastructure and team that people take different roles. It's kind of like the old saying, you don't want the fox guarding the hen house. You want to make sure that you separate the roles so that no one individual has all of that. They have the power to configure all your devices. So in that case of using that example I was using earlier of multiple firewalls and other devices, certain people might be defined. Okay, Bill, your job is to go and secure the firewalls. And Nancy, your job is to handle the routers. And Sally, your job is to handle the servers. And Tom, your job is to set up the new clients for people. And you're going to help maintain this policy and set it up. And then at some point, 6 months from now, we may rotate those jobs so that we can see if, okay, Bill was messing around with the firewall, leaving a back hole in there for him to get in when he quit someday, and the other person will hopefully catch that. And by not having it so that one person has the keys to the entire kingdom, so to speak, then even if Bill has left that hole in the firewall and he leaves before the rotation, maybe nobody caught it. Well, he's still got to figure out how to get through the router and the other steps along the way that, of course, he didn't have full access to and didn't know all those super secret passwords, etc. It looks like that this is mainly a recording today. I didn't see if anybody came and popped in and out, but I'm getting near the end of my hour and I've talked through it all. But I guess it's okay since there's nobody here to ask questions. Once again, my name is Lee McWhorter. This was the week 1 lecture for Intro to Security Foundations as part of the cybersecurity program at WazU. We will have another one next week. I'll post it to the portal. This will be posted online, I believe, to our YouTube channel here shortly after. Got to work out a little administrative detail for getting that posted correctly, but I'll get this downloaded and we'll get it online so that other students and future students can take a look at it. Thank you very much for your time, whether you're attended part of this today or watch it at a future time. Look forward to seeing you soon. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.